Well, folks, today I want to talk about Dragon Prince, which we started watching recently, just finished season 2. And apparently, realism and fantasy is still a topic that a lot of you enjoy hearing about, so we'll talk about that. Don't expect to see full scenes from the series, by the way, because, well, copyright on YouTube is a minefield, so I'm just going to use still images, plus a couple of short clips, 5 seconds or less, to be on the safe side. So this, by the way, it's really freaking good. I've definitely been enjoying it. I would highly recommend checking it out if you haven't watched it. Now, since it's a fantasy setting, I approached it with no expectation of seeing any kind of realism beyond the basics, gravity and certain ways in which humanoid bodies work and all of that. But it was pretty interesting to see some surprisingly realistic weapon designs. The first time I noticed that was pretty early on in the practice fight between Callum and Sauron. By the way, don't worry, I'll avoid spoilers. And the practice swords are really well shaped. I didn't expect that. This is something that you could absolutely use in real life, no problem. And pretty nice detail on that if you look at the pommel on this. And perfectly appropriately shaped, not oversized, not crazy, weirdly unergonomic handles or anything like that. None of the typical tropes you see. Just one thing I would say is they're awfully pointy for practice swords. It's not the safest thing, but otherwise. And then the swords that the guards are equipped with. Those look really good, very realistic. The armor is clearly fantasy, but it's nothing outrageous. It looks like this would work if you made this in real life and wore it. And the swords in particular, in fact, they look kind of familiar. The hilt looks a lot like the sword in the middle here, which is a reproduction of a mid-15th century hand-and-a-half sword, except that this one has a longer grip. Perfectly well-shaped, a scabbard too. I can only imagine that they were looking at reproductions for inspiration, and yeah, it's slender, well-shaped, proper ergonomic grip, nice pommel and everything. The polearms are also very realistic. This halberd here, for example, perfectly well-shaped, practical, usable. This one here in particular looks a lot like historical halberds. If not for the armor, just going by the weapons, this could be from a historical setting. What also really surprised me was the crossbows. Those look exactly like historical ones, and they are very detailed. So they clearly looked into what crossbows look like back then, and they designed them just like this. There's no crazy stuff. They're properly proportioned. They're the right size. All the parts are recognizable, and yeah, if you could literally make a one-to-one replica of these crossbows in Dragon Prince, and they'd work. Here's another look at that crossbow, and also a close-up of the hilt on that sword, and that halberd again in the background. So this just, I did not see coming at all. It's fantasy. You expect all kinds of outrageous stuff. It has that too. We'll get to that later. A lot of the purely fantasy designs also have that pragmatic feel to them. Like King Harrow's armor here. It doesn't specifically look like anything from history, but you can recognize certain elements. Like on the pauldrons, they have that raised guard that acts as a blade stop to prevent it from sliding up the pauldron and going into the neck. You can see the straps holding the pieces in place, and he seems to be wearing a gambeson underneath. At least it looks like a padded undergarment. It's not a whole lot of armor, especially for a king, particularly compared to the suits of armor that are standing in the hallway on display. Those offer a lot of protection. You'd think that a king would have this much protection, but on the other hand, it does fit his character, because King Harrow is not the kind of person to place himself above anyone else and demand special treatment and all that. So this is probably a deliberate choice. The fact that he doesn't have any more armor than the guards, and this would work perfectly well until someone tries to stab him in the abdomen. That would be a bit of a problem, but it looks good, it suits the character, and it would be perfectly usable. So his sword is a bit of a different story. Now, it would still be usable depending on the kinds of materials that you use. It's a bit of a clunker. That guard here, that's very, very thick metal. It looks like brass, but if it's something else, if it's some sort of fantasy alloy that's lighter, if it's more comparable to aluminum maybe, yeah, you could get away with it. It doesn't look very aesthetically pleasing because of how thick and blocky it is. The same goes for the pommel. It's also very blocky. It's still usable. It doesn't have any spikes directed at the user's hand or any of the other obvious deal breakers in terms of practicality that you often see. Then there is Saurons Sword. That sounds weird. Which is also obviously fantasy design. Doesn't look like anything in history, but still usable. I have one objection, which is the pommel is tiny. But otherwise, it's fine. Nothing really wrong with it. The female guards get the exact same armor. Whoa, right? No chain bikini, no exposed belly or cleavage or boob plate or any other ridiculous nonsense. All right, so finally I also want to comment a bit on some of the more outlandish designs, more fantasy-like. There is Amaya's shield, which I actually like. This is a pretty cool design, looks neat. And that overall shape, I think generally would work pretty well. It's a bit thick and clunky looking. So you would probably need something other than steel that is still of comparable strength. Because otherwise this would just be very, very heavy and unwieldy. But if that's not an issue, just going by the shape alone, the cutout in the middle is pretty interesting. You could trap an opponent's weapon with that quite well. I think it goes a little bit far down to the point where if you were to catch something, you'd have to make sure to keep the shield pretty far away from you because that's getting rather close. So you're sacrificing some coverage, but at the same time, you can use that to bind and trap an opponent's weapon, and also you can look through it. Because that's a common issue with shields. If you cover yourself with your shield and you obstruct your vision, that's a bit of a problem. So it's actually not a bad thing. And the design really works. I mean, Amaya is a total badass, so she gets to have a badass shield. Makes sense. On to Rayla's swords. They are interesting, to say the least. So it's basically a large battle song. That's pretty much what it is. With the exception that in this art here, it looks like the blade is longer than the handles, which is impossible. If that was the case, then the point would stick out of the handle at the bottom, and it wouldn't fold in properly. So that's a little weird, but it really depends on the angle and the scene. In some scenes, it looks like the blade is longer, and others it looks like it's the same as the handles. The real cheat here is whenever she magically transforms the blades into sickles. Even in this official art here, the sickle blade is just shown separately because they're like, yeah, this doesn't actually go anywhere. And if you look at the slow-mo here, it's pretty hilarious. They completely cheat. Like, it's literally in the middle of the movement, the blade just swaps somehow. It just turns into the other thing. There's no way that could possibly work. Even in a fantasy world that has magic and everything, there's really no explanation for why on earth this would work. Unless, I don't know, the one blade phases out into an alternate parallel dimension and the other one pops in. You'd have to come up with something really bizarre. But this is, this thing is BS. Let's put it that way. Don't get me wrong, it's pretty cool and it has that elven vibe to it, even though they're kind of strange elves. I've never before heard Scottish sounding elves. Like, that's usually reserved for dwarves. Why on earth dwarven elves? It's kind of heresy, isn't it? Anyway, it has nothing to do with it. But this is harmless compared to the dual sword bow. This thing is just completely nuts. Just completely what on earth even is. Yeah, there's really, outside of whatever kind of mystery magic that is unexplained, there's no way to make that work. Um, just sticking them together in such a way, in a secure connection that is easy to release, and that's actually solid and isn't just a weak spot waiting to break, that in and of itself is difficult enough. But to expect that construction to function like a bow and flex evenly and all of that is no. Sunforged blades are clearly magical. There's just nothing real life about them, but they're well shaped. They're not grotesquely oversized or anything. And if magic existed in the real world, then that would work. Or if you had some kind of plasma blade or something, it's a really nice design. This looks pretty neat, and most of the fantasy designs I quite like, actually. It's just, sometimes it irks me a little bit when it just goes completely off the deep end. Fantasy will be fantasy, but it's sometimes there are just things that don't even really make sense within the premise of that world, But anyway, so as said, would definitely highly recommend checking it out if you get a chance. It's a pretty awesome series, and yeah, interesting designs for sure. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and have a good one, folks.